Hello and welcome to Middle East Matters. This week we meet Islamic State prisoners captured by Kurdish forces. They insist the extremists aren't as bad as the West wants to make out. A survivor of the attack on Egyptian Christians in Libya, one which left 21 people dead, talks to our correspondent as Christians and Muslims in their hometown think of them during Easter celebrations. And water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. In Lebanon, environmental groups are sounding the alarm on dams being built and corruption that is controlling supplies. Eyewitness accounts and other evidence strongly suggest the use of chemical attacks by the regime on Syrians several times over the last month. That's according to Human Rights Watch. Caught between regime forces and armed insurgents, the situation in Syria is only getting worse. For the past 2 years, Kurdish fighters have been trying to repel the Islamic State group. It managed to capture some of its members. Martine Laroche-Hubert met them. Shona Bhattacharya has the story.
A welcome pause. Kurdish fighters put down their weapons long enough to celebrate the Kurdish New Year, a popular holiday that's become synonymous with resistance. For safety reasons, the square is protected by armed men. The war front is not far off, and the threat of attacks never completely disappears. In a house close by, several prisoners of war await their fate. These men are jihadists who joined the Islamic State group. Their Kurdish guards say they were captured in combat 4 months ago. One is Syrian, a boyish 18-year-old. The other is a 24-year-old Turkish fighter who says he's a sociology student. They agreed to speak to the camera.
I decided to join the Islamic State organization because for me it was a legitimate state.
How is it legitimate?
Well, because it's a purely Islamic state, and there is no God but God. The Islamic State teaches you how to treat Muslims and infidels. I received military training, and during that training, I met French people.
How many French people?
There were 4 of them. There were fighters just like me, on the front lines.
Do you agree with the Islamic State group's practice of decapitating prisoners?
Personally, I've never seen it happen, but I know it's happened a lot.
And why do they do it?
Because they say they're infidels. It's the emirs that behead people, not ordinary fighters like me.
The massacres and the rapes, I've never seen these things with my own eyes. I've only seen the videos on the internet. I only believe what I see with my own eyes. Television and the media fabricate all these things.
The interview comes to an end. Guards haul them away outside quickly so no one sees them. They're afraid the prisoners will be lynched by an angry mob if word gets out they're here. A car is waiting to take them to a secret prison where they could be exchanged for captured Kurdish soldiers.
Well, the threat of the Islamic State group was hanging over Coptic Christians as they marked their Easter celebrations. 21 Egyptian Christians were killed by the radical Islamists in Libya last February. They were working in Syria. Our correspondent in Egypt, Sonia Didri, went to visit their hometown where she met their loved ones and indeed one survivor of the attack. Sanam Shanti has the story.
Al-Ur, a village south of Cairo burdened by tragedy. 13 of 21 Egyptians beheaded by the Islamic State group came from the dirt lanes of this village and attended Mass in this very church. In front of it, security guards are on standby. This year's Easter Eve ceremony is taking place in the shadow of the mass killings, and no one can forget the devastation that shook the world 2 months ago.
There is sadness in our hearts, but we are comforted by the fact that they found martyrdom.
Father Makar presents the brother of one of the victims, Yusuf, who was 24 years old when he was executed.
He travelled because he wanted to prepare himself for his wedding, and there was no work here. I can't deny that as soon as we saw the video, we broke down, especially my mother, who's sick. Even now, it's still very hard on her.
These Muslims have also come to church in show of solidarity.
There's no difference between Muslims and Christians here. When they were kidnapped and fell into the hands of the terrorists, the entire village was crushed.
Amongst those reflecting in the church, Hannah. He was in the same dormitory as the 21 Egyptians, but he managed to hide from the militants.
They struck on January 3rd at around 2:30 a.m. They entered the building. They were all masked. They handcuffed whoever they caught and took them outside. That's when the owner of the dorms called me and asked me, "Where are you, Hannah?" And I told him, "I'm in my room." And he said, "Do not open the door. They're targeting you guys especially."
And it was his nephew Mina and two of his cousins who were targeted. They were kidnapped and beheaded a month and a half later.
I cannot look anyone in the eye. Do you understand? And I haven't until today. I've isolated myself. When I visit my relatives, I feel they blame me for leaving them behind.
Meanwhile, the Egyptian government has vowed to provide job opportunities for the relatives of the victims. They also offered last week the equivalent of 12,000 euros per family in compensation. But for Hannah, the struggle continues. Today he's taking the time out to show us this land on which the authorities have pledged to build a new church in honor of the slain men.
The refugee camp of Yarmouk remains under the control of armed groups with thousands of people trapped there. Little to no food or water getting in. Here in Paris, two brothers who fled the camp are singing the rap of refugees, hoping that their words will be heard and that peace will finally return. Julien Sauvager and Shirley Sitbon went to meet them.
The rappers that rocked music halls in Damascus, criticizing Bashar al-Assad, are now far from home. Yasser and Mohamed, Syrians of Palestinian descent, found refuge in Paris. Back in Syria, they called their group Refugees of Rap because their families had fled their home countries. Now they too have had to escape.
After September 2013, we started learning French and we came here. It was difficult at first, but everything will be all right.
Yasser and Mohamed are not planning to stay in France. They hope to get back to Syria, which they write about in their songs.
We talk with people in Syria to keep up with what's happening there. We want to know all about their suffering. This inspires our songs, which are all about Syria.
For the past few months, they've been living in the studio apartment.
22 square meters, not great, huh?
The apartment may be small, but here they're safe. France has recognized them as refugees last year. The brothers grew up outside Damascus, in Yarmouk, one of the oldest Palestinian refugee camps. More than a week ago, Islamic State organization militants took control of the camp. But Mohamed and Yasser don't believe the gunmen belong to the terror group.
People told me they used to be another group, not the Islamic State group. But then they became Islamic State, just like that.
Feeling some guilt about leaving Syria, the brothers believe they contribute to the fight through their political songs.
It's called the People's Revolution. It explains the current situation. It's not a civil war. It's the revolution of a people that began peacefully.
1 million litres of rain falls per person per year in Lebanon, and yet water is massively lacking. Clean, drinkable water, that is. Daily cuts have prompted private companies to drill illegal wells, and the state is sponsoring the building of several dams. But environmental organisations say these will not solve the problem. This report from our correspondent.
They can be found on every rooftop. Private water storage tanks are full in the early springtime, but by summer they'll be empty. And that's when private water vendors step in.
We have a real problem with water. Between July and November, there just isn't any.
That water carries a high price tag and often comes from places like this abandoned factory. There are some 20,000 wells like these in Beirut and the Mount Lebanon region. The manager says that everything here is legal, a rare find in this lucrative business.
There are people digging wells who may not have permission and whose water perhaps isn't clean, but they have no choice because they need the water. Then they sell it because there's no water in Lebanon.
Over a decade ago, the government started addressing the situation by planning 18 dams. 7 projects were launched, but they've all faced the same major problem. Lebanon's mountains contain limestone, a porous rock that allows water to seep into the ground. This infrastructure expert heads a campaign against the dam projects. He argues that the mountains serve as a natural reservoir, which could support enough wells to supply the whole country. According to him, the real reason behind the dams is a far cry from the official version.
This is mainly corruption, and the reason is simple. These dams will cost about $2 billion. When we do projects that cost billions, there are perhaps hundreds of millions that can be embezzled. The alternatives only cost a few tens of millions of dollars.
As the man in charge of hydraulic projects at the Ministry of Water, Fadi Komer believes the dams are necessary, but he doesn't deny the existence of corruption in the system.
Not under my roof. There are perhaps other institutions or organisations that work on hydraulic infrastructure who don't submit their accounts to the Government Accountability Office. But I'm one of the rare ones, the very rare ones in Lebanon, who's fighting against corruption.
The ministry asserts that this year will be a turning point for Lebanon. Water shortages are expected to increase due to the influx of more than 1 million Syrian refugees and global warming, which could dry up as much as 30% of the country's water resources by 2030.
Well, that brings us to the end of Middle East Matters for this week. Do take care.